Praise be to Jesus in there. We have just heard the conclusion of St. Mark's Gospel. The author, St. Mark, was not a disciple of Christ during his public life. He came to faith after the resurrection, probably converted by St. Peter, who describes him as my son in the first reading. The first time Scripture speaks of him is in the Acts of the Apostles, when it tells how St. Peter was freed from prison by an angel. When the angel left him, the apostle thought about what to do, and then went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who is called Mark, where there were many people gathered in prayer. So St. Mark has two names. He called himself by the Hebrew name John when he had dealings with Jews like himself, and by his Roman name Mark when he had dealings with Romans and others who spoke Greek. Having two names like this was a common thing for Jews. Saul of Tarsus was also known by the Roman name Paul. The house of St. Mark's mother was large, and she had servants. There is a servant who answers the door when St. Peter comes knocking. Answers the door, but is too stunned to be able to open it. So St. Mark was from a wealthy family. This house could be where the upper room was located, the place of the Last Supper and so many other important events like Pentecost. In any case, it was probably in the upper class neighborhood where the high priest also has his home. And that would be consistent with a late tradition that says that St. Mark was a descendant of Aaron, so from a priestly family. After St. Peter let the people there gathered in the house of St. Mark's mother, let them know that he had been miraculously freed, he left Jerusalem, perhaps going directly to Rome. So St. Mark was probably converted by St. Peter earlier and would have been one of those Christians who was there gathered in the house praying for him. The next time that the Acts of the Apostles mentions St. Mark, it calls him by both names. It says after Barnabas and Saul completed their relief mission, after they brought aid to the poor Christians at Jerusalem, or after they went to gather aid for the poor Christians at Jerusalem, they returned to Jerusalem, taking with them John, who is called Mark. So he was St. Barnabas' cousin. He served as a helper during the first missionary journey. Halfway through that journey, however, he left them. Probably the intense pace of the mission and the persecutions that they encountered were too much for him. When St. Paul was beginning his second missionary journey, St. Barnabas wanted to take Mark with them, but St. Paul felt that he was unreliable. Since they couldn't come to an agreement, Barnabas took Mark with him to evangelize Cyprus, while St. Paul, with another companion, went to Asia Minor. Later, St. Paul must have changed his mind about St. Mark, or decided that he had matured, because we find St. Mark mentioned at the end of letters to the Colossians and to Philemon, where the apostle mentions Mark among those who are with him. In St. Paul's last letter, he tells Timothy, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is helpful to me in the ministry." In the meantime, St. Mark had also worked with St. Peter and had become his interpreter. St. Peter didn't speak Greek very well, so he needed a Jew who, like St. Mark, could translate for him, a Jew who knew Greek well. St. Mark, obviously, who was capable of writing the Gospel, was competent in Greek. We know that they worked together, at least in Rome, because of that first reading. So St. Peter sends greetings from himself, or sends greetings, in addition to his own greetings, sends greetings from the church at Babylon, that is to say, Rome, called Babylon because it was the head of idolatry, the head of, and also the power that was occupying Israel. And so St. Peter sends greetings from the Church of Rome and from St. Mark. So clearly they were together there in Rome. Ancient writers around the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd tell us how St. Mark's Gospel came to be written. When St. Peter taught about Jesus in Rome, so great a light of religion shone upon the minds of the hearers of St. Peter that they were not satisfied with merely a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine gospel, But with all sorts of entreaties they besought Mark, who was a follower of Peter and whose gospel is extant, to leave behind with them in writing a record of the teaching passed on to them orally. And they did not cease until they had prevailed upon the man, and so became responsible for the scripture which is called the Gospel according to Mark. So the content of St. Mark's Gospel is consistent with this. At times, instead of using the proper Greek word for something like centurion, it takes the Latin word and transliterates it into Greek. So while well-educated Romans knew Greek and knew it well, people of all social classes became Christians in Rome. So having a Greek text in which hard Latin words were replaced with, or hard Greek words were replaced with their Latin equivalents, made things easier for those members of the church who didn't understand Greek very well to follow the gospel. So we also see that St. Mark's Gospel is the one in which stories are told in a way that could be a little embarrassing to St. Peter. It doesn't hide his mistakes, the things that he did wrong. And so while the other evangelists had respect for the head of the College of Apostles, St. Mark is recording what St. Peter did. And St. Peter, in his humility, wasn't afraid to say that when he'd misunderstood or when he'd done something wrong. St. Jerome says that when St. Peter learned about this gospel, he approved of it. And then after that, St. Jerome continues, taking the gospel which he himself had composed, St. Mark went to Egypt, and first preaching Christ at Alexandria, he formed a church so admirable in doctrine and continence of living. They constrained all followers of Christ through his example. So an exemplary church in which holiness is shown, the holiness that St. Mark had learned from St. Peter, had learned from, and also from St. Paul. And so in AD 62, St. Anianus succeeded St. Mark as the Bishop of Alexandria. It seems that St. Mark left the city at that point to evangelize elsewhere. Later he returned and was martyred there, perhaps in the year 68 at the end of the reign of Nero, after the martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul. The traditional story is that a rope was dragged about, or was tied around his feet, and that St. Mark was dragged by this rope through the streets until he was dead. Centuries later, Alexandria fell under Muslim rule, and in 828 the Muslim ruler of Alexandria decided to build a large palace. To have space to build it, he'd have to knock down some existing buildings, including the shrine of St. Mark. And so to prevent this desecration of the relics, a monk and the priest Theodore made an agreement with two Venetian merchants to take the relics to safety. They were no longer safe in Alexandria. So these two, who were named Bono and Rufino, took the relics of St. Mark and they put them in a basket, but somehow they had to get them out of Alexandria, get them through customs. So they covered the basket with pork, and the Muslim customs guards who didn't want to have anything to do with pork didn't look under it to see if there was anything hidden. And so the relics of St. Mark made their way by ship to Venice, and the following year, 829, a church was built to house those relics, a church which was gradually expanded and became the Basilica of St. Mark with its mosaics and its many precious things. Praise be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.